going to be discussing political parties today. This will be the first part of this lecture, so be sure you come back and finish up with part 2. So let's go ahead and get started. We are talking about political parties. So political parties, what are political parties? Well, first and foremost, political parties are organized groups that attempt to influence the government by electing their members to important government offices. By doing this, they are thereby trying to control government. So political parties extend their popular political participation. They promote effective choice and they smooth the flow of political business in Congress. So first and foremost, they're organized groups, and their sole purpose is to attempt to influence government by electing their members. So keep that in mind as we go through this unit. So organized groups, they extend political participation and they promote effective choice. They smooth the flow of political business in Congress. Now, political parties arose from the electoral process. For most of the history of the United States, two major parties have had enough of an organized presence to oppose each other in elections in most of the nation's towns, cities, and counties. This makes the American party system one of the oldest political institutions in the history of democracy. Political parties play a traditionally important role in elections. In earlier times, the parties had near monopoly control over the electoral process. However, in recent decades, political parties have lost their monopoly to candidates who decide not to work within the party. And we'll talk about that a bit more further down. Now, parties and elections. What do political parties do? Well, some of the things that political parties still do are parties recruit candidates. So parties recruit candidates for national, state, and local offices. The party leaders identify strong candidates and entice them to campaign. Now, ideal candidates will have flawless records and the capacity to raise serious campaign money. Now, stop and consider that. Ideal candidates will have flawless records. That comes into play more so now, today, than it did before with the advent and the use of social media. Anybody can find out anything about you. Anybody can dig into your past and find out if you cheated on a test in the 5th grade. I mean, it is ridiculous how far back and how in depth these campaigns go. But by the same token, you want to know who your candidates are, right? So be aware, these are some of the things that you have to consider if you ever think about running for office. Now, second, parties organize nominations. Nominations are the process through which political parties select their candidates for elections to public office. Now, Article 1, Section 4 of the U.S. Constitution provides for states to have the power to set time, places, and manner of elections. It reserves to Congress the power to make such laws if it chooses to do so. However, the laws and the Constitution are silent on nominations, setting only age and citizenship requirements for candidates at the federal level. So the U.S. Constitution remains silent on nominations, apart from setting the age and citizenship requirements for anybody who runs for Congress or the presidency. Third, parties and elections, right? So political parties help get out the vote. Election periods are right after nominations. So the first electoral step involves registration. Then on election day, registered voters decide whether to go to the polls and vote for the candidates or referenda that is on the ballot. Political parties, candidates, and campaigning make a difference in convincing the voters to vote. Parties have developed extensive data files on potential voters, especially at the local level. Stop and consider the people who represent you at the local level in the Texas legislature. These are people from your neighborhood, from your churches, from your jobs, from your community that are running for office. So political parties help get out the vote by walking the streets, handing out flyers, registering people at churches, at schools, at grocery stores, at libraries, running registration drives so that they can have people who are eligible to vote registered long before the election so that they are then able to vote without any issues. Next, political parties facilitate voter choice. Parties and campaigns help most by providing information. When voters must choose among obscure candidates, meaning you have no idea who these people are, and you are unclear on what they are running on, what their policy agendas are, what they believe in, it is up to the political parties to make these things easier for you and to facilitate a choice for you so that you have a clear understanding of who you are voting for. Next, political parties organize power in Congress. Now, the parties' relationships and influence on governmental institutions are significant. We have seen that with this new Congress here in 2021 and how political parties play a role in committee assignments in which of the representatives and senators are placed on whatever committees or hearings. The tasks that they are given, the responsibilities that they are given are great. And the political parties are the ones who choose the people for these responsibilities. So political parties wield their power in Congress and use their influence to help pass policy. Now, especially in the House and the Senate, Congress is particularly dependent on the party to develop and to determine the leadership in the House and the Senate. Remember, whichever party has the majority in the House and in the Senate is who is in power in Congress. The congressional committee system is also a product of the two-party system. For example, and as I mentioned before, each political party is assigned a quota of committee members, and this is depending on the percentage of legislative seats held by each party. Also, individual committee assignments are also left to the party to decide. So depending on what committee the Democratic Party wants their members to serve on, it is then up to the party in Congress to decide the assignments for these committees. And lastly, presidents need political parties. The president depends on Congress, on the people from his party that are in Congress to support legislative initiatives. If the president does not have a majority of his party in those seats in Congress, then the chances are very low that he will pass much of his agenda. As we see in 2021, Joe Biden has the majority of his party in power in the House. So passing bills in the House should be easy. I say should. That does not guarantee that it will be. But because the Democratic Party has the majority in the House, it should make it an easier process to pass bills in the House. The Senate is evenly split 50-50. Therefore, if the Democrats want to pass policy right now, if they want to pass their bills, then they will have to convince Republicans to vote with them. Or if it comes down to a tie, then Vice President Harris will have to, of course, break that tie. So you can see how political parties hold power in Congress and how it is important to be the party in control in Congress. Now, the U.S. party system. It is, of course, a two-party system. This means that it's a political system in which only two parties have a realistic opportunity to compete effectively for control. This two-party system has dominated American politics, although parties were in competition since the beginning of time. It has changed over time. And the parties that were in control at the beginning of our formation, of this country's formation and our government's formation, even though they have changed, what we see is that we still have a liberal side and a conservative side. And the years have culminated into today's Democrats and Republicans. They weren't always called Democrats and Republicans. They have had other names. We will go over them here shortly. But you will see that there has always been a left and a right, right? There's always been this opposition. And regardless of any third parties, there have always been two dominant parties, and thus the two-party system that we end up with. Now, we're going to talk about electoral realignment. And it is because of electoral realignment that this defines the party system in American history. What this means is that with electoral realignment, this is when a new party supplants the ruling party in history. Basically, one party becomes more dominant than the other. It's a show of dominance. It has been going on since the early 1800s, and every so many years you will see that one party will supplant the other. So going as far back as 1800, there has been some agreement among scholars and historians about 5 different realignments, political realignments or electoral realignments in American history. And these are 1800, 1828, 1860, 1896, and 1932. Now, 1932, this is the last realignment that historians really agree on. This took place during the party system when the Democrats, under Franklin Roosevelt's leadership, took governmental control and maintained it until the 1960s. Now remember, this is the era of Depression. We'll talk about it here shortly, about the administration before Roosevelt that took the brunt of the responsibility for the United States falling into a depression, and it is because of this that we see these realignments happen in 1932. Now, since then, American party politics have often been characterized by divided government. Now, divided government is the condition in American government wherein the presidency is controlled by one party, while the opposing party controls one or both of the congressional houses. Now, historically, realignment occurs when new issues and economic crisis combine to mobilize the people to re-examine their party loyalties and political party shifts. Now, such periods of realignment have had important institutional and policy results. So we're going to start and review quickly the first party system. Now, this refers back to the Federalist and the Jeffersonian Republicans. This is as far back as 1790, when we see the first party system emerged, and it pitted the Federalists and the Jeffersonian Republicans. Now, the Federalists, remember, supported mercantilism, tariffs, assumption of the state's Revolutionary War debts, the creation of a national bank, and the resumption of commercial ties with Britain. However, the Jeffersonian Republicans were promoting agrarian interests, meaning agriculture, free trade, and friendship with France. Now remember, this is after the Revolutionary War. This is once we have established our country and are trying to write our Constitution. Now in 1800, Jefferson won the presidency, taking his party to power. At this point, the weak Federalists collapsed altogether after being associated with pro-British sympathies, especially in the War of 1812. Now, until the 1830s, the U.S. went through an era of good feeling because of the absence of party competition. The sole political party became known as the Democrats. Now, that is just the word used. That does not mean that they are the same type of Democrats we have today. In the 1830s, Jackson won 2 presidential terms while supporting free trade and policies which would make it easier to borrow money. Now, opposition to Jackson led to the formation of a new political force known as the Whig Party, thus giving rise to the Second American Party system. So we go from a one-party system, because everybody was happy, everybody was doing well, to a new president coming in who starts doing things that the people don't like, and thus we have to oppose him in some way. So a new party is created, and that is the Whig Party. So this brings us to the second party system. Now this is pitting the Democrats, now these are the people that supported Jefferson, and the Whigs, right, those that were against Jackson. Now during the 1830s and 1840s, the Democrats and the Whigs built party organization by expanding the right to vote. The Whig Party was strong in the Northeast and among merchant groups. So it won the presidency easily, and they used campaign tactics such as using food drives and giving people drinks to come in and vote. But it didn't last for very long, right? This happiness never does. In the 1850s and 1860s, we see conflicts arise. Now, what happened in the 1860s? Well, conflicts over slavery produced sharp divisions within both the Whig and the Democratic parties. So by 1856, the Whig Party had been dissolved, and many of its supporters joined the new Republican Party. In 1860, the Republican Abraham Lincoln, during his presidential election, sparked the Southern secession and the Civil War, right? Because at this point, the Republican Party, of which Lincoln was a member, we have shifts in social issues. In this case, slavery. The North and the South pitted against each other. During the first party system, we saw Jefferson and his Republicans versus the Federalists. So you see these shifts happening when there are issues within society, issues that mean enough to the people to rise up against the party that is in power. So what we see after the second party system is the Civil War and post-Civil War party system. And this is where we see Republicans and Democrats. So President Lincoln relied on support from the Republican governors and state legislators to defeat the Confederacy in 1865. After the war, Republicans sought to convert the South from Democratic to Republican through Reconstruction programs. However, the Southern populations were resistant and they ended Reconstruction efforts and gave the former Confederate states full Union membership and control of their affairs. African Americans, of course, were deprived of their political rights despite post-Civil War agreements. So we see that the Republican Party remained the party of the North with support from a strong business and middle class, and the Democrats of this day were the party of the South with support from northern working class groups and immigrants. So already we are starting to see the shifts between the people and the parties that they are willing to associate themselves with. Now notice that I said that the Republicans were the party of the South. However, they did have support from northern working class groups and immigrants. So keep that in mind. Now the system of 1896 also pitted the Republicans and the Democrats. In the early 1890s, rapid social and economic changes led to the emergence of protest parties. So we start to see these third parties. One of these parties was the Populist Party, which won strong national support. However, the Populist Party later merged with the Democrats. Now, think about the parties and the people that are in office now, especially in Congress, and how not all of them actually align completely with the parties that they support. Now, the Republican Party of this time, representing Northern and Midwestern business interests, sought to defeat or at least contain the populist Democratic Alliance. In 1896, the Republican William McKinley won the presidency, and Democrats found themselves holding power only in the South and the far West. For the next 36 years, Republicans were the nation's major party, and Democrats were too weak to offer much opposition. Now, the Republicans of this era were the American Business Party, advocating low taxes, high tariffs on imports, and minimal governmental regulation. Now, the New Deal system. Unfortunately, this brings us a reversal of fortune. Now, soon after Republican Herbert Hoover became president, the economy collapsed. So we are talking about the 1930s. As a result, Americans felt that the economic hardship produced by the Great Depression was the Republicans' responsibility because they were the ones in office. In 1932, Americans elected Democrat Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, along with a Democratic Congress. So we have a joint executive legislative branch, right? Both branches are controlled by the Democrats. FDR developed the New Deal, an economic recovery program that substantially increased the national government role in economic management. So this revitalized the Democrats and made their coalition of unionized workers, upper middle class intellectuals and professionals, Southern farmers, Jewish populations, Catholics, and African Americans, the majority party for the next 36 years. Now, during the 1960s, the New Deal coalition was severely strained by conflicts over civil rights and the Vietnam War. So we see that the factions, the various divisions within the Democrats, provided an opportunity for the Republican Party to return to power in 1968 with Richard Nixon. So you can see here we have another social issue, this one being civil rights and also our participation in Vietnam, that is dividing the party system. And so now we are seeing we are going to our next party system, which is the contemporary American party system. So in 1964, presidential candidate Barry Goldwater lost to Lyndon B. Johnson, and this was after JFK had been elected. So Barry Goldwater helped to crystallize what would become the Republican Party themes as a candidate. In his book, Conscience of a Conservative, he argued in favor of reduced taxation and spending, less government economic regulation, and elimination of many federal social programs. Nixon, though, had his Southern strategy. He gave the Republicans the needed votes to end Democratic political dominance. And as far as into the 1980s, with Republican Ronald Reagan, the Republican Party kept adding important coalitions to their party. They brought in religious conservatives who were offended by Democratic support for social issues such as abortion and gay rights. So you see these parties as far back as the 1790s. Every time there is a social issue that comes up where you have the population pitted against each other, you see breaks in the parties. And you see one party take control for a number of years, and then the next party will come in and take control for another long stretch of time. But every time that these parties switch control and power, it is because of social issues that have been brought forth. You could argue, and I'm sure many historians could argue, that the way that we are right now, in the era that we are in right now, we are seeing another one of these U.S. party system shifts, primarily because there are divisions within both parties, within the Republican and the Democratic Party. You have very left-leaning members in Congress of the Democratic Party that do not agree with the core political values of the Democrats. And the same way with the Republicans, you have members in Congress that are very far right-leaning, and that they would both are to the extremes and would not want to follow congressional leaders and the president letter for letter, word for word of what they want to accomplish. During Trump's administration, we saw Representative Ocasio-Cortez try to introduce a new Green Deal that would have brought in radical changes to regulation, to renewable energy, anything that would help save the environment. But it was shot down not just by the Republicans, but by the Democrats, who thought it was too extreme also. So just be aware that as long as we have been a nation, there have been shifts in our political parties, And we see these predominantly when there are social issues at the forefront that have dominated the conscience of the nation. Last year, it was the killing of George Floyd, all of the mass murders that we have had, the mass shootings. Um, One just happened not too long ago, um, here within days in Colorado. Um, so now we're going to see these party systems be put back to the test, because once again we are facing social issues that mean a lot to the people, but which have divided the political parties when it comes to making changes. So just consider that these are important shifts in history, and that it always involves the political parties and how they are able to come to the forefront to address these issues. So I'll end it here for now, and I will see you guys on part 2 of political parties. Thanks.